readers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspirations for growing your self-publishing business. We're your hosts. I'm Joni.
And I'm Stephanie.
In today's interview, we were talking to Sam Maggs, who is a best-selling writer of books, comics, and video games, including Marvel Action Captain Marvel, The Unstoppable Wasp, Built on Hope, Tell No Tales, Conquest, and Marvel's Spider-Man PS4. Her work has taken her to comic book conventions all over the world, but she's originally from Toronto.
So Sam talked to us a lot about many different topics we covered in this episode. But she talked to us a bit about writing nonfiction and fiction, the difference between the two. She talked to us about female friendships. We learned a bit more about geekdom and being a fangirl in a community that is majority men. She also talked to us about being a woman in popular culture and then the crossover, which makes a lot of sense now that I think about it, between the indie author community and also the fandom community. So we cover a lot of topics. Sam is also a friend of our intern, Rachel. So she kindly passed on her friend and we couldn't miss our opportunity to interview her. So it was a great chat. We hope you enjoyed as much as we do.
So our guest today is Sam Maggs. Sam and I went to elementary school together. We were a grade apart though, so I was a year older, so I was a year cooler, so we did not hang out until high school. We were both huge music nerds and both part of music council because we're exceptionally cool. And we became really close and we would go to like Starbucks together and write and dream of being writers. And one of us succeeded, and spoiler alert, it wasn't me. So yeah,
Exactly.
So that's how Sam and I know each other. And yeah, we've been close ever since. We go to concerts together a lot, traveling internationally. I'll go to LA or she'll come to Toronto. We see each other at comic book conventions. And yeah, she's my bud.
Awesome. Well, thank you for setting it up.
Relationship going. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you guys.
I'm wondering what instrument you both played.
That's a great question. I played the viola, which was like a joke instrument that everyone made fun of. Rachel was much cooler than I was.
I played the alto saxophone and the violin.
Yeah, see?
That's cool,
way
Rachel.
Cool.
That is cool.
Yeah.
I was going to say, music teacher was also my mom, though. So I don't know if cool is the right word.
That is true.
I love that. Do you guys still play?
I have a violin.
Yeah, I still have my viola too, but it's in Ontario. So I'm like, maybe one day it would be really bad. My neighbors would be upset to hear me try to learn how to do that again, though.
Next time you're
It's
home.
also not the kind of instrument that you can jam at a party. You can't just pull out your viola.
No, it's true. There's no cool points there whatsoever. That's a great point.
Okay, so we'll get into it now. We'll stop talking about violas. Sam, can you tell us a bit about yourself and then your journey to publishing?
Sure. So my name is Sam Maggs. I'm Canadian. I lived in Toronto for about 10 years. I did my BA at Western in English, and then I did a master's degree in modern literature at Ryerson. And after my master's degree, I had gone straight from high school to college to grad school and never wanted to write anything again in my entire life. I was like exhausted of writing. So I had a brief foray into film festivals and TV. But after about a year, I realized that actually writing is the thing I love to do most in the world, and I wanted to do it again. So I started writing online for a bunch of local blogs to do with nerd culture. I grew up a big nerd. I've always been into comic books and video games and sci-fi, stuff like that. And so, writing about being a girl in geek culture was kind of the one thing that I knew how to do. So I started writing about that online and posting articles on Twitter. And before long, I got hired for a weekend editor position for like a geeky news outlet. And then that became a full-time position. And then through Twitter and sort of my online following, I was found by a literary agency out of Toronto. And from there, I sold my first book, which was also about being a girl in geek culture. It was called The Fangirl's Guide to the Galaxy. And that was the start of my professional writing career. And it's all kind of snowballed from there. So now I do everything from comic books to video games to nonfiction books to fiction novels, middle grade, YA, kind of all over the place. So it's been a very fun adventure. Feel
That's
very lucky.
Very cool. Yeah. You wrote a book called Wonder Woman, 25 Innovators, Inventors, and Trailblazers Who Changed History. And I was wondering if you could tell us if you have a favorite Wonder Woman from history and who that is.
Oh, I do. Yeah. Wonder Woman is all about women in the history of science and technology, engineering, math, women in the STEM fields. My favorite gal from that book is called Anandabai Joshi, and she was an Indian woman in 1888. She lost a child shortly after childbirth and figured that if she had had a doctor around that he would not have died. So she vowed that she would become a doctor. But of course, women at that time in India weren't even allowed to go to school, let alone get their medical degree. So she posted a letter to a missionary group and was like, I really want to go to America to become a doctor. Will you help me? And the missionary group wrote back in their published newsletter that they would totally love to help her as long as she converted to Christianity. And she was Hindu. And she was like, well, that sucks. I'm not doing that. So meanwhile, in Roselle, New Jersey, a woman named Theodosia Carpenter, like a young widow, is at the dentist's office waiting to get her teeth cleaned. And on the table is a copy of this missionary journal. And she picks it up and she reads this response to Anandi. And she's like, well, that wasn't very Christian of them. That sucks. So she found Anandi's address and wrote her a letter. And Theodosia and Anandi became best friends overseas as pen pals for years and years and years. They used to send each other recipes and snippets of their hair, because I guess that was a thing you did then. It was probably not creepy. It feels creepy to me now, but I'm sure it was a normal cute thing that you did or whatever. And eventually Anandi bought a ticket on a steamship and made her way overseas and lived with Theodosia and was admitted to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, which was one of the first places in America that would accredit female doctors. And she graduated in just 3 years with a medical degree and went back to India and became a general practitioner for sick women. So pretty cool. I was I love that because it's the power of friendship. She's apparently the first Hindu woman to ever step foot in America. She was very successful because she made buds. And I don't know. I love the moral of that story.
I love that.
Really badass.
So cute.
Yeah.
So what I really loved is what you said in the intro of this book about representation. Can you talk to us a bit about the importance of representation in the media and why it matters so much in publishing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that we talk about this a lot in pop culture now, but everybody deserves to see themselves on the screen and on the page as the hero of their own story. And I think, with books like Wonder Woman and Girl Squads and Fangirl's Guide, it was really important to me to kind of get it out there that women are into geek culture. Women do become scientists. Women are successful when they work together, because a lot of the times I think we as women are socialized by the patriarchy to want to compete with each other instead of cooperate with each other, that we're kind of taught that there's only room for one, there can be one girl who writes comics, or there can be one female astronaut or whatever. But that's obviously not the case. That's fiction, right? That we all kind of have been taught from birth by there's one female Smurf, or there's one female Avenger or whatever, So it's really important to me to move past that, both in fiction and in nonfiction, so that girls growing up can see that they really can do anything and see examples of people who have, gone down those paths with their lives. I think that overall publishing is doing a great job of expanding representation on the page. I think we see a ton more queer stories of people of color, stories about women, stories about marginalized communities than we ever have before. I think that where publishing still struggles is the same spot where video games still struggles and comics still struggles, and TV and movies, is getting that representation increased behind the page, because we want more people telling their own stories. We want a diversity of experience coming to the writing so that we can get those authentic stories from their points of view. And I think that's really cool. The more people we have telling their own stories, the more different stories we get on the page and on the screen. And that benefits everybody,
Absolutely. You talk a lot about geekdom and being a fangirl and being part of that community that has historically sidelined women a little bit. Have you faced any kind of gatekeeping in that area as you've been involved in that writing world, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Geek culture is full of that, as you know. I remember when I first moved to Toronto to do my master's degree, I went to a pub night that was being hosted by one of the local comic book stores, and I was excited to go and meet other people who had my interests, and I had finally decided to put my geeky self out there. I kept it hidden for a really long time, and I was like, no, I'm going to be authentically who I am. And I went to this thing, and I remember talking to a guy who worked at the store, and I was like, I really like comic books, whatever. I was 21. And he was like, oh yeah, well, name Peter Parker's parents.
Oh God,
like,
he's
So it was
quizzing
like
you.
a terrible episode of The Big Bang Theory. And this was like 10 years ago, right? Before this discourse about like testing people or whatever about their nerd knowledge had really like come out. It just like genuinely happened to me. And it was, I just remember being like, maybe, but also like, can you name every episode of Stargate SG-1? Because I can. Like, it doesn't matter. It's so stupid, right? And what gets me about that is like, if I was into something and somebody else came up to me and was like, I'm into this too, I'd be like, sick, a new friend, like that rules. We can like bond over liking this thing together instead of being like, no, that thing is for me only. Wait. And like, I don't know, I talked about this a lot. Like, I understand where the impulse comes from. And I think it comes from a place of like, for a really long time, geek culture has been something that people make their whole identity out of. You know, it was a safe spot for them to kind of feel like accepted among their people. And this was a thing that they really liked and they really identified with and was really important to them for a really long time. And I totally get that because it's been really important to me too. And so when they see more people getting into it or like a new type of person getting into it that they've maybe never seen before, I understand why that could feel threatening or challenging or intimidating in a lot of ways. But I think the key is to just realize that creativity is not finite. You know what I mean? Like, just because I want more Captain Marvel comics doesn't mean I don't want Captain America comics. Like, you could still have Captain America. You could just also have Captain Marvel and Shang-Chi and Black Panther and all these other heroes so that a bunch of people can also see themselves represented as heroic. It doesn't have to be a threatening thing. You know, you can still love the things that you love. Just embrace the fact that more people love it. Like, I think that's a really good thing. And again, the more people creating that stuff, the more better like diversity of stories we're going to get, which just makes for more interesting books, really.
Definitely.
Agreed.
And like, there's space for everyone. That's always what I say.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's exactly it.
So can we just talk a bit, I think we'll go to your writing process. So you write for books, comics, and video games. So does the writing process for you change between these different mediums, or is it kind of the same? How does it go for you?
That's a great question. I think generally the process is similar. I mean, there's no like correct way to write or whatever, but I personally am an outliner. So for every project I start, I always start with an outline with the knowledge that like things will probably change as I start the actual writing, but I like to have a roadmap. I'm definitely a roadmap person, but I work on spec a lot. So when I pitch comics or, you know, if people ask me to write IP novels, so like The Unstoppable Wasp, obviously that's not a character I own, that's someone else's character. So oftentimes what you have to do is pitch to get those jobs. So it's on me first to sort of send outlines to editors that are like, what do you think of a story like this? And that's kind of how I get a lot of my work. So outlines are really key for me. I start by outlining. I like to put down a brief kind of like either I'll outline each issue in a series of comics or, you know, each chapter for a novel or each mission in a video game. And then from there, I'll sort of expand into the writing. I like to try to get the first draft done as quickly as possible, mostly because I hate writing. Like generally it's really painful for me and feels awful the whole time that I'm doing it. So for me, I just want to like get something, I want to like barf something down on the page as quickly as humanly possible. Yeah. So that I can then go back and fix it because it will probably be terrible. Most people's writing at the first draft is terrible, and that's like totally normal and okay. So I like to just get something. Getting something on the page is the hardest part of writing for me. And it's the thing I try to get done fast, so that I'm usually in revisions for a pretty long time. I like to go through many, many drafts until I'm happy with it. And I've been really lucky to work with great editors who are happy to help me get to that point as well, which is nice. So yeah, I'm a big outline person, and then fast first draft, and then lots of other drafts.
Do you have any tips for pitching ideas to publishers or agents or people like that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I guess it's different depending on the medium. So querying agents has like it's a very specific skill set, I think. And there are a lot of really good resources online, like Query Shark is a great website that I'm sure a lot of your listeners already know about, but they dissect queries on their blog, and they'll kind of talk about like what works, what doesn't, what makes it better, because that's like writing back cover copy, which is such a unique and challenging skill set. So I would really, if you're looking for an agent, definitely visit a lot of websites that talk about how to query write in a very eye-catching and effective way. If you're looking to pitch comics, I think a great first step is networking. A lot of the times you want to find other comic creators. So if you're a writer, find an artist who might be able to help you make your own comic and kind of put your work online. One thing that really helps when pitching is to already have an established, I don't want to say a body of work because that can sound intimidating, but like finished work that you can show editors, you know, what your style is like, that you're capable of finishing things. I think a lot of the times people ask me, you know, I really want to be a writer. What can I do to be a writer? And the answer is, you know, write something and finish it and make it available for other people to read and then start the next thing. Like a lot of people really want to write and then just never finish anything. And what will set you apart from other people who are like, I really want to be a writer, is actually like having written something. That's really important. So I would say have, you know, quote unquote, a body of work, like a Twine game or a web comic or, you know, a partial manuscript or something like something like that before you have your pitch. And then if you're looking to pitch a graphic novel or a comic, it's great to have a bio of yourself, a synopsis of the comic or graphic novel itself, and little paragraphs about each one of the characters. That's a really good place to start.
Awesome. I was also interested in not just the writing process, but for your nonfiction titles, I think Girl Squad and Wonder Woman, what was the research process like? Because really you were kind of pulling out the stories of people who are maybe being a bit overlooked in history. So I wondered if it was easy to find that information or what that journey was like, I guess.
It was exhaustive and exhausting, but I'm a really big nerd for research. Like I love doing it. So for me, that process was actually really fun and exciting because I love digging into something and finding like the original source of a quote in like the primary source, like way back. I love looking at where accepted notions of historical figures came from and what biases, you know, that potential reading may have had when it was first published and why we think that way about someone. So for that, I'm like a big nerd about that. So I used the University of Western Ontario's library system pretty exhaustively, which is great. So like the Ontario University library system was really, really helpful. I spent a lot of time at the Toronto Research Library, which is my favorite library in the world. It's so huge and awesome, and the collection is massive. I love spending time there. I loved working there. Just reading tons and tons of books and scholarly articles and getting subscriptions to lots of old newspapers. There's actually a really great website called chroniclingamerica.gov where you can go back and read newspapers dating back all the way to the 1700s. So if you want to look up like what happened on your birthday in like 1883 or whatever, you can go and do that. It's really cool. It's all free online. They've all been digitized, which is really neat. I think like my favorite example of researching, finding a story that just didn't fit and doing original research was I was reading a lot about Mary Bowser for Wonder Woman. And she was a spy for the Union Army during the American Civil War. She was a Black woman who had been born, you know, she'd been born in Virginia in the South. She was free. She lived with a white family, but Black people weren't permitted to be literate at that time in the South. So the family that she lived with sent her away so she could get an education. And when she came back, it turned out that this family she was living with were actually the spy masters for the Union Army. So they made her a spy and they installed her in the Confederate White House where she acted as a maid. And of course, the Confederate president assumed that she couldn't read. So would just like leave her in rooms with like all of their plans for what they were going to do. And she would read all the plans, obviously, and then go back and be like, here's what they're going to do. And they'd be like,
oh my God,
like, sick. Thank you so much. So she was amazing. Like that's a pretty amazing story in and of itself, right? Like that's already really cool. But then if you go on Wikipedia and in a lot of other like pop history books, people are like, and also she had a photographic memory. And she burned down the Confederate White House and like walked away in slow motion while she put her shades on and like, oh, she left a diary behind and all these other like claims that go from making her like very cool to making her like basically a superhero. And so for me, immediately that pings my like fake alarm that like, that's my like suspicion alarm right there. It's like, if something is like too cool, like life is not a movie, right? So if something is too cool, chances are there's something in there that just like isn't quite right. So I started to go back and trace out where these particular claims came from. Like how do we know that she had a photographic memory? And like, how do we know that she burned down the White House? All this stuff. And it turns out that all of that information came from one interview, which was given orally in the 1970s from a guy who was like, my great-great-grandfather's best friend's cousin totally knew her. And here's her story. And just like said it. And then the university published all this stuff that he said. And now all this information about her, quote unquote, that he gave in this interview is like published on Wikipedia and all these books. And so for me, I'm like, press X to doubt. Like, that's suspicious. That's just like me being like, oh yeah, totally. I know this stuff about, like, even if he had the best of intentions, that's like a really long game of telephone he's playing. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, it's really important to be aware of where the information you're getting is coming from. So I don't know, but I love nerding out about stuff like that. So even though the research process was challenging, I thought it was really fun.
It sounds like it was fun.
Yeah. Did you end up editing Wikipedia a lot?
You know, I didn't, and I honestly should. Maybe now that the book is out, I should like use it as a source. That's a really good idea.
Yes.
I've never edited Wikipedia, but interestingly, I think like a very small percentage of Wikipedia editors, like under 10% or something, are women. So there you go.
Interesting. I didn't know that. So you mentioned earlier about female friendships, and sometimes the expectation is that we kind of compete against each other and that there's only any space for one woman. So have you found this to be the case in publishing, or have you found the author community to be supportive?
I have actually found the author community to be very supportive, and I think it's because publishing is really women dominated. There are a ton of women authors, there are a ton of women editors, there are just a ton of women in publishing in general. Although I don't find that applies to like the people in the highest positions, which is, again, suspicious and definitely sucks. So a lot of like the actual labor of the publishing industry is on women, whereas a lot of like the credit and the money goes to the men. It's like, whatever, you guys work in publishing, you know what I'm talking about. Like, so that is definitely still a bummer, but I have found that the actual community of authors and stuff has been really, really supportive. One of my favorite conventions to do every year is Y'all West, which is, I'm not sure when the podcast is publishing, but we're actually doing a digital version of Y'all West this year called Y'all Stay Home this coming weekend, April 24 to 26. And it's run by authors, an entirely white author community puts it together. Authors do all the panels. It's completely free for everyone who attend, for all the teams who attend. And I love doing that every year. And I think the Y'all Fest and Y'all West and now Y'all Stay Home is just such a great example of how the YA author community in particular really comes together to help each other out and, you know, be supportive. I really love that.
I wanted to ask you about conferences and conventions and that kind of thing, because I think there's a lot of crossover between like the nerd community and the indie author community. And I imagine that, like for some authors maybe who want to go to a conference but are nervous about it or don't quite feel comfortable, like, do you have any advice for people that want to go but they're a little bit intimidated, I guess?
Oh my gosh, totally. I'm like a huge introvert, and I have had to teach myself over the years how to be a fake extrovert for things like this podcast or conventions or like any of the number of things that you have to kind of do as an author to promote your own work, to promote your book. You have to be a little bit like not only author, but also like graphic designer and publicist and speaker. And like you have to wear all these different hats as an author that maybe you don't necessarily expect when you go into it. I certainly didn't. I was just like, I'll just write and hide behind my computer forever, which would be the dream, but unfortunately is not the case, especially not these days when there's so many books out there and so much competition. I think that conferences is one of the best ways to make connections, not only for your work, but also personally. I think people always sort of suggest making connections above you, like, oh, go talk to editors, go talk to agents, go talk to publishers and stuff. But for me, the most useful connections that I've made at conventions have actually been my contemporaries. So finding other authors at my level who are either like just starting out in publishing or published a couple books or, you know, at a certain point we're trying to get published or whatever, and to kind of form a network amongst those people, because those are going to be your peers as you come up in the industry. And so it's really important to form those relationships with them. And, you know, if one of them gets a deal, then if you've been supporting them for years, you know, they're more likely to kind of get you a connection or, you know, for those things to come from a more authentic place. So going to conferences is difficult. I say go with the intent of making friends with peers from your community. If like, you know, editors or publishers, that kind of stuff works out, that's great. You know, go with the intention to learn. But let me tell you my number one trick that I have learned. I learned this from an ex-boyfriend of mine who I'm still very close with, but who was a TV personality, and he taught me this because I was very terrible in gatherings and like on air and in all these different circumstances. And the key for me, the trick that I have learned is whenever you go to one of these things and you feel really awkward, or if you're at like a pub night, or if you're at a conference and you're at like a round table or whatever, and you have to be entertaining or talk to people and it's weird and scary, the trick is ask questions. All you have to do for people to think you're like the awesomest person in the world is to ask them questions about themselves. Because you know what every single person loves to do? Talk about themselves. And then you also don't really have to talk a lot. So all you have to do is sit there and be like, so where are you from? Tell me about your book. Oh, when did you start writing? What's your process? Like, just ask them a bunch of questions, and then they'll do most of the talking, and then they'll come away from the conversation being like, that was the best conversation I've ever had. And you'll be like, ooh, I just made it through that conversation with like no problem at all. And it's the best. Honestly, that's like my ultimate party trick, asking questions. It sounds really simple, but it really works.
I think that's good advice. Sometimes I do that too. It's sometimes hard to figure out what to say, but if you can just be like, what are you writing? That usually opens up for authors, definitely.
Yes.
And then I was wondering, since you were saying relationships with your contemporaries, do you use social media as a way to talk to authors, or is it more to promote your books? Because you kind of said it's kind of given you jobs in the past. How do you look at social media?
Yeah, I look at social media definitely as a tool for getting jobs. I've gotten pretty much I got my agent through being vocal on Twitter. I've gotten a ton of video game jobs through my connections on Twitter. I think it is really invaluable. I think both Twitter and Instagram are really invaluable. I'm terrible at Instagram, so I'm not really one to talk about it, but people who are great at Instagram, I'm very jealous, and teach me. But I think they're both really invaluable tools for promoting yourself and your work on the one hand, but then also for making those connections with people, especially now when we can't go outside to conventions. You know, talking to other people online and just being really genuine with people and interested in them is the best way to make connections and to like quote unquote network, I think, in this industry. I can't recommend it enough. I made friends with a bunch of contemporaries at my level through Twitter who I then met at cons, but that can also make conventions a little less scary because you kind of go in knowing people that you've met on the internet, which, by the way, isn't that funny? I feel like when we were growing up, people were always like, don't meet someone from the internet, you'll die. And now it's like, if I met someone who I didn't first meet on the internet, I'd be like, no.
How do I know you're real?
Yeah, exactly. But yes, I love Twitter for that.
You said that an agent reached out to you via your work on Twitter. Is that right? Because that never happens.
That's right, yeah.
Was there something in particular that you'd shared that had that agent be like, we can sell this?
That's a really good question. And I actually don't know if I know the answer to that. And I should ask my agent. So this was about 5 years ago. I was still really early in my career, but I think I was just writing a lot of articles at that time about something that wasn't being talked about a lot. Like, we weren't really talking, not a lot of people were talking about women in geek culture and really vocal and kind of like, at that time I was very incendiary online, like a kind of like agitated way. So I think that the points that I was putting out there about women in geek culture was just sort of at the tipping point for that moment in the zeitgeist. And so I was very fortunate that at the time I was writing a lot about that through websites like Ecosystem or like on Twitter or on the Mary Sue, that was something that was missing in the book market at that time. No one had written a book about women in geek culture before, which seems weird to say now, but it's true. Like, Fangirl's Guide was the first book about that. So I think it was partially that. And then it was partially, you know, my agent who I ended up signing with was a big nerd. So our interests intersected. And also, she was new. She was an associate agent at an agency in Toronto. She had never sold a book. We were both actually at like a really similar point in our careers, both starting out and both just trying to figure out like, okay, how do we do this? And so instead of signing with like, you know, trying to like go for big agents who were like very famous and like had all this clout and all these like important clients, I signed with an agent who had never sold a book in her life, who I just got on with really well personally. And that ended up being a great choice for me. I mean, again, everybody is different, and, you know, I'm not telling you what to do.
But that's a really good point. And
yeah.
I think it does speak to what you were saying earlier about diversity in publishing, because, and this isn't like a dig at trad publishing at all, but I do think there's an overrepresentation of possibly
totally.
like fewer young people, like there's a certain type in publishing, right? So it is kind of
100%.
cool to have somebody who's just starting out and maybe isn't as enmeshed in like, well, this is how we've always done it, so this is how we have to keep doing it. Like somebody who's like, well, why don't we try this? Because why not? I'm new.
Well, 100%. And like, you know, we both had this idea of like, here's something that's never been done before. Let's find the publisher who can do it. We're both really excited about this. We were both like in our 20s, both Canadian, like both just trying to figure stuff out. And, you know, signing with a sort of new agent was one of the best things for my career, I think, largely too, because now like we both have this loyalty to each other now. We're like, I'm ride or die for her and vice versa. Like we have come up together. We have succeeded together. Like, she's been my champion for years and years and years. And so we have like a really cool relationship now, I think, that goes beyond just like, you know, business or whatever. Like we were there for each other from the start, you know? So, and I think you're right. Like there is the instinct to kind of be like, oh, well, I'll go, you know, these places have a reputation for a reason. And like, I'll go for big names because that'll give me like big money. But if you sign with a big agent, you're not necessarily going to get their time either. You know, like if they have a lot of like big clients and you're kind of like one of many, you can kind of fall by the wayside. I mean, the same goes for traditional publishing. Like I started my career at a small publisher called Quirk, who only published 25 books a year. And because of that, they were able to dedicate a ton of time to the design of my books, to the publicity of my books. They sent me all over the world to conventions. Like I feel like I got a lot of things from them that I would not have gotten if my first book was with like, you know, a big like publisher like Penguin Random House who have like 1 million books that come out every year from people like way more famous and like way more talented than I am. They probably would be like, we don't have a lot of time for you, and like rightfully so. Like they have to make their money back. I totally get it. But like, would I be in the place where I am now if I had done that? I don't think so. I think there's a lot of benefits to like small agencies, small press.
And I think that it works. Like there's a reason like things have been done a certain way for years, and that can be really successful. But it's also, I think, really important to know that that's not the only way. And that there's like, and I think there is a little bit of that that's starting to change, which I'm pretty excited about. But there are definitely like, there's so many opportunities beyond like, this is the way we've done it for the last however many decades. So let's just keep doing it because we know it works.
You see that in comics publishing too, where like for a really, really long time, the only way to get a comic published was to like get in at the big two, like Marvel or DC, and then you could make comics. But now like there's no barrier to entry. You just make a webcomic and put it online, and then 1 million people will see it, and then you'll be Noelle Stevenson. Like there's never been a better time to try to get into this stuff, because I think, to your point, a certain large segment of the audience has been ignored for a really, really long time. And so they're just like hungry for content that speaks to them. So if you're putting that out there, like that's a whole market that is just waiting for you and for your voice. And like, and then when a bunch of people see it, then publishers will be like, we like money, bring it here. You know, not to be like cynical about it, but like, let's be honest, you know?
No, totally. Like people follow the money. And so if it works, then it works. I wondered actually, like, I know that you were talking about women being less included in the kind of geekdom fandom world, but something I noticed in your book is that like, I tend to associate that kind of thing with comic books and Marvel and that kind of world, but there's also like the Harry Potter fandom and all the other like YA books. I wondered if that had anything to do with women and young girls being more included, or if it's something completely different.
I think that's probably true. I think that like, yeah, it's like book fandom is so heavily skewed towards girls and women. And I think it's because, yeah, the publishing industry does just have so many more women in it. So I think that's a part of it. Like those books do speak to girls more than, you know, industries that women haven't been involved at all. I mean, to this day, something like 16% of people who make comics are women, and 22% of people who make video games are women. Whereas Yucca Publishing, it's like the opposite of that, you know? So I think that having women involved in those decision-making processes definitely makes a difference.
Do you think that there's any, like, how have you seen the last few years change in terms of the role of women in pop culture, gaming, comic books, whatever else?
Oh, I think there's been like a huge amount of progress in the last decade, certainly, but like definitely in the last 4 or 5 years. In part, I think because of social media, for the first time, we're able to speak directly to these companies that make the things that we love and that are important to us. And we're able to say directly to them, like, hey, we're this huge market. we're here, we're waiting for content, we want to give you money for it. Like, what are you waiting for? Help us help you, basically. And there's a lot more accountability, I think, and there's a lot more visibility of that segment of the market. We're able to be kind of like loud and visible online in a way that either they weren't able to before, they didn't feel comfortable doing before, they didn't feel comfortable going into a comic book store or onto these forums where these kinds of discussions were popular. You know, Twitter is pretty, you can find your own community on Twitter or on Tumblr or on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. So it's a lot easier, I think, for people to speak out and to feel accepted and like they have backup, I guess, in a lot of these cases. So I think we've come a really long way. Like I said earlier, I think we've especially come a long way on representation on the page and on the screen. I think we have a ton. We have female superhero movies now. That's awesome. We have superhero movies with people of color, and like we have a ton more books that feature like complex female characters, not just like, you know, damsels in distress or, you know, strong one note, like strong female characters or whatever. And that's great. But I think that where we still have a lot of work to do is behind the page. Like, again, I do think publishing is like ahead of the curve in terms of this, but then we have to look at the other ways that we're not accepting marginalized people into the community.
Do you have a favorite fandom?
Oh my gosh. Yes.
The hard
it's
question.
so embarrassing.
Go for it.
Stargate. Stargate is like my OG fan. I know. Okay is the correct answer to that response. Like, it doesn't make any sense. I've loved Stargate since I was like 12 years old. And I don't know, I was like obsessed with it growing up. I think in large part because the main female character on the show, A, had my name. She was also named Sam. And B, she was an astrophysicist, but she was also a soldier. And she was also funny. And she was also allowed to have love interests. Like, it was kind of the first time on TV I had seen a female character who was like more than one thing. Like, she wasn't just tough or like just smart or whatever. Like, she was like a real person. And so I think that really attached me to the show. And so I started going to Stargate conventions when I was 18, and I still go every year. And I'm like still friends with all the women from those cons. And like Stargate fandom is mostly middle-aged women because there are like a lot of hot guys on the show. I'm assuming that's why.
I did have to Google this.
Can I just tell you that I had never heard of Stargate, but last night I was texting a friend in the US and I was like, what are you watching right now? And she's like, Stargate. And I was like, oh, that doesn't interest me at all. But I'd never heard of it until yesterday.
Totally fair. Yeah, first of all, I'm like 100 years old. So that's
she's not. She's going to be very offended if she listens to this. And she's like, excuse me? No, that's really funny though.
That's so wild. That's like a sign from the universe. Honestly, it's very like 90s sci-fi, which is extremely my jam. Like, it's hokey and it's cute and it's funny and it's all like characters and family. And it was like pre-Battlestar when everybody decided that science fiction had to be like deep and like grim dark and like angsty or whatever. And with shows like The Witcher, I feel like we're maybe returning to that a little bit. So fingers crossed.
Honestly, that does sound like exactly what we need in these wild and woolly times that we're going through right now. I actually wanted to ask you about that because you have a book coming out next month, right?
I do. Yeah. My book with Marvel Press, The Unstoppable Wasp Built on Hope, is coming out May 26th. I think it's 26th. Yeah. Yay.
What has that been like, releasing a book when you can't really do everything that you normally do? Oh, God.
Just so depressing, start to finish. Just like a nightmare. So it's fine. Like, I still feel really lucky that I have this book coming out, but it is like so many of the things that we would normally do to promote the book, or that, you know, selfishly, like I had been looking forward to for a really long time or whatever. Like, all this stuff is no longer happening. Like, we can't have a book launch party. I'm not going to go on tour. We were going to have a, you know, San Diego convention exclusive cover for the book that you could only get there. And we're not going to be able to do that anymore because there's no convention. Like, all this stuff that are markers of like, I don't know, success in the traditional publishing world, like just can't happen now. So it's definitely made us have to like reassess how we go about selling the book. And I think when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, like, that stuff actually doesn't move that many units, really. Like, it's cool, and I love traveling, and no one listens to this, so I want to keep doing that. But also, like, it's not really, to be honest, it's not really that effective, like, in terms of getting the book in front of people. And so I think this is a really as much as I'm like, man, that all that stuff would have been really cool and I was really looking forward to it, I think this is a really cool opportunity to actually sit back and be like, well, how do people read books? How do people find books? How do people see books? And how do we use those channels in the most effective way possible? Like digital e-reading, that's way up. Like, hello, I'm here. Like, let's do this. Let's make the Kobo like version of this book the most popular ever. Like, a lot of people have been doing virtual book release parties where they like play fun Zoom games with other authors and like get a chance to interact with people. I think maybe the best example of this, when we were talking about Y'all West, that's in Santa Monica every year. It's at a high school, a few thousand people come. It's pretty cool. This year it's online and we already have 35,000 attendees registered for it from all over the world. So it actually is really like democratizing to put all this stuff online. People now have access to these events and to these authors who they wouldn't be able to without, spending the money to go to a convention, which can be like really expensive, and travel's really difficult and stressful and anxiety inducing. And now like you can do it all from the comfort of your own home. And I kind of hope it does give us a chance to reassess like how we do this when things go back to quote unquote normal. Maybe, prioritizing audiobooks more, prioritizing e-readers more, prioritizing that digital audience more, because I think it really gives us a chance to both like, sell more books, obviously, but really like connect directly with the audience who's actually reading those books more. But I actually still don't really know the answer to the question, like, how do we do this now? Like, it's something that I'm on phone calls with my publishers about every week. Like, what is the answer? What do we do? How do we get the book in front of people who don't already follow me on Twitter? I don't really have the answer to that yet. Maybe we'll
Fair
find
enough.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you give a brief plot synopsis about it? I don't think you mentioned it for anyone interested.
Yeah. So The Unstoppable Wasp is about a Marvel character called Nadia Van Dyne. She is the stepdaughter of Janet Van Dyne, who is the original Wasp. She was actually one of the founding members of the Avengers. She came up with the name The Avengers. And her husband was Hank Pym, who was Ant-Man. If you saw any of the Marvel movies, that was Michael Douglas. And so she is Hank Pym's daughter, and with another woman, not Janet. And so she was kidnapped at a young age and put into the Red Room, which is the same like Soviet Russian training facility that Black Widow was raised in to become a spy. But instead of going into like the spy side of things, they put her into the science side of things. And they were like, your dad was really smart and he came up with like these Pym particles that could shrink people. Therefore, you must be really smart. And like, we want you to try to do the same thing. And she was like, okay. And then she did. And then she used those particles to escape and fly to America, where she found Janet, who adopted her. So she gets to New York City. And if you read the comics, which are really, really cute, they're by Jeremy Whitley. You can buy a couple of trades now, probably online, digitally. But she comes to New York City and she discovers that S.H.I.E.L.D. has released a list of the 100 smartest people in the world. And the first woman doesn't appear on the list until number 27. And so she becomes enraged, obviously, because this cannot possibly be the case. Like in the Marvel Universe, Moon Girl is technically like the smartest person. Anyway, so it's just like, she's like, this is nuts. This sucks. This is just because they just put their friends on the list. So she decides she's going to start a community of teen girl scientists that she calls Genius in Action Research Labs, or GIRL. So she goes all throughout New York City and she recruits all of the smartest teen girl scientists that she can find. There's a Chinese gal who is also like trained as a spy. There's a Black girl who lives with her dad who's really good at physics. The Chinese gal is really good at chemistry. She recruits a New Yorican gal with cerebral palsy who's like an amazing mechanic. And then she recruits an Indian American gal who is an amazing botanist. And so together they have this really diverse crew. Two of them are dating, which is cool. It's kind of gay, which I love. So we start out the book and she has like this cool crew, lady scientist. She's a teen awesome superhero scientist. And her whole thing is like, I'm so busy. She's like, I'm trying to be a superhero. I'm trying to be a Wasp. I'm also trying to lead this like science lab. I'm also trying to be a good friend. I'm also trying to learn how to drive. I'm also like trying to figure out what being an American is. Like, she's just got all of these things on the go, which I feel like a lot of us can relate to, and especially teens can relate to. We expect so much of teenagers to be doing like a million things all at the same time, like very successfully. And she's just like, this is nuts. I'm super overwhelmed. She has bipolar disorder. She's also trying to deal with that. Like, she's going to therapy. She's trying to get healthy. Like, she's dealing with all of these different things in her life. And she discovers a device that promises, it's like kind of an Apple-esque device called the Vera, which promises to give you more time to do the things that you need to do. It's going to like organize your life for you and help you get all the things done that you need to get done. And she's like, this is awesome. I want to try this. And so she ends up befriending the woman who has designed this device. And of course, things go terribly wrong from there. But it's all about basically Nadia trying to get control of her life and also kind of discover who she is, discovering her mother, her family, you know, her found family, and her friends, and what all of that means to her, while also trying to figure out what it means to be like a normal, quote unquote, normal teen, whatever that is. So yeah, that's kind of the book. That was really long-winded, but
it sounds really fun.
I wanted to give us some background.
No, I needed it. I think many other people might need it too.
No, that's cool. Marvel is very like, okay, like there's so many characters, so which is great. And it's awesome to be able to write a Marvel book about like bipolar girl who's not interested in relationships and, you know, is Russian and, you know, like, and has this like diverse crew of like gay friends. Like, it's great that this exists, I think, you know, there's so much in there for everything.
Do you have terrible men on Twitter yelling at you about how you're ruining their childhood by diversifying Marvel?
Oh, I have terrible men.
It's a thing, Steph. Right, guys?
Actually, I mostly get yelled at for video games.
Okay.
Fans have been very pleasant and kind to me, so I feel very lucky about that. But I do also feel that we spend so much time talking about all the like crappy stuff that happens online. Like, yeah, that stuff totally does happen, and I hate it, and I wish that it didn't. And you know, I think we're making a lot of progress towards it not happening, which is great. But like, those number of interactions are so small and negligible compared to like all of the amazing relationships with friends that I've met online, and like the cool people that I've met online, and the cool job opportunities that I've gotten online. Like, that's so overshadows by like 1,000,000% all the negativity. And so I really try to focus on that.
That's really
because
good
otherwise I think
know.
it's too easy to get caught up in being like, oh. Yeah.
Well, what was the movie that came out? I know that this is a really obvious one, but what's the one where they put women instead of men and everyone flipped out? You guys know what I mean?
Oh, Ghostbusters.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I don't know what you're talking
the
about.
whole of Twitter like lost their minds over it, and it's like, dudes, like, calm down.
You can always go back and watch the first Ghostbusters. We didn't delete it. It is still there. Yeah.
No, but it's actually really good to know that you get more good stuff than bad from people. Because you never know.
I also love the mute button. You know,
Oh,
whatever.
that's true.
But yeah, no, I think it's important to remember that the good outweighs the bad so much, and like, you know, it's totally worth it.
So then our last question, and the most fun question, is what have you been loving lately? It can be anything, book, movie, TV show, podcast, whatever.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm going to do like a couple things. So I just finished Libba Bray's Diviners quadrilogy. Oh my God, the last book came out like just about a month ago, and it's so good. It's set in the 1920s, and it's got like all this spooky witchcraft, and it's also very diverse, and it like deals with a bunch of questions about what America is, and like, oh my God, such a good series. Totally recommend it. I also just binge watched the whole first season of Gallivant, which is like a comedy
people keep telling
musical. It's so funny. It's like a comedy musical about knights, and it plays with all those tropes really well. And it was, it's like 18, 22-minute episodes, so it's like very fast to get through, which is also like a big plus for me right now because my attention span is garbage in this time. So that was really nice, but that was really, really fun. Yeah, those are the two things that I'm loving right now. I'm loving my dog, my 5-month-old Cavalier King Charles puppy.
Oh, those are very cute. Can you please send us a picture that we can include?
100% I will do that. Any
Awesome.
opportunity to show pictures of my dog, I'm into it.
Excellent.
And then where can listeners find you online?
You can find me on Twitter. All my social media handles are just my name, Sam Maggs, SAMMAGGS. And as always, like if you guys have any questions, any listeners have any questions for me about publishing or anything like that, you can hit me up anytime. I'm always online, unfortunately. It's a problem.
That's awesome. That's a great offer too. Well, thank you for talking to us. This was great.
Thank you so much. This was such a blast. I really, really appreciate it. You guys have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you're looking for Sam's books, we will have linked to them on our blog. Or if you're interested in learning how to grow your sales, visit kobowritinglife.com.
This episode was produced by Joni Placido and Stephanie McGrath. Editing is by Kelly Robotham. Music was provided by Tearjerker. Big thanks to Rachel for her help with this episode, and huge thanks to Sam for being a guest today.
If you're ready to start your self-publishing journey today, sign up for free at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing!